The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, ISO Standards Overview and LCA Update. My name is Debbie Steckel. I am Executive Director at the American Center for Lifecycle Assessment. For anyone who is attending an ACLCA webinar for the first time, I'll quickly provide a bit of background about ACLCA. ACLCA is a nonprofit membership organization that brings together diverse organizations with a stake in the implementation and application of life cycle assessment. ACLCA also produces the LCA Annual Conference, the largest LCA meeting in North America, along with monthly webinars, member newsletter, certification programs, and an active industry, education, policy, PCR, and certification committees. Hope that you will join us if you're already not a member, and you can find more details on our website at www.aclca.org. Now, some quick housekeeping. All attendees are in listen-only mode. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, but you do not need to wait to the end of the webinar to get your questions in. You can type your questions in the GoToWebinar panel, and we will make sure they make our way to the panelists we have today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to you by Monday, January 29th. In the meantime, feel free to email any questions to me at dsteckel@aclca.org. Now let's move to the meat of this webinar, what I'm sure you all have been waiting for. I'm happy to introduce our speakers today. We are excited to have Jennifer Prinsing, a 10-year sustainability professional who's currently Sustainability Manager responsible for reporting at the Dow Chemical Company and also a member of the ACLCA Policy Committee. Mike Levy, who is Senior Director for a group within the American Chemistry Council, the Plastics Food Service Packaging Group, a national organization representing major producers and raw material suppliers of plastics, food service, and packaging products. Mr. Levy also serves as a Senior Director of Lifecycle Issues for the Plastics Division of ACC, is on the ACLCA Board and Chair of the ACLC Policy Committee. We are also honored to have Dr. Kuma Sumathipala, who is Director of Fire and Energy Technologies with the American Wood Council, also on the ACLCA Board and a member of the ACLCA Policy Committee. Now let's jump in and get started with Mike.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Again, my name is Mike Levy, and I'm with the American Chemistry Council. I'll put in a little plug for the members of the Policy Committee, and Jennifer's going to go over that with you. The group that Debbie represents, the American Center for Lifecycle Assessment, has really been a great forum for all of us to participate in on a number of issues, in particular this ISO issue of standards and LCA. So today we're going to cover a number of things. For those of you that are really new to the whole ISO process, I'll take a few minutes to kind of go through the ISO 101 and get you acquainted with the lingo and the vernacular that's used. And then Jennifer and Kuma really get into our involvement on the various committees, particularly the LCA group. So again, let's move forward, and I'll talk a little bit about the ISO process. So what is an ISO standard? The International Organization for Standard defines a standard as a document established by consensus, that's key, and approved by a recognized body that provides for common and repeated use rules, guidelines, and characteristics of their activities aimed at achieving the optimum degree of order in a given context. Basically, at the ISO level, this is a consensus organization, so that's key to an international standard. So again, what does a standard do? a standard does a number of things. It defines the fitness of an object or a process for a specific purpose. In our case, we'll talk a little bit about the life cycle standards, for instance, and how it interchanges. It also establishes different criteria, not only for safety, but for implementation. It establishes effective management of quality and environmental management systems. And speaking as someone who was involved back in the early 90s for this particular life cycle standard, it really does give credibility, I think, to the whole process. Once an ISO standard is developed, and then it takes a number of years for people to use it as practice, it gives you some kind of credibility. So how are these ISO standards developed? Well, basically, ISO develops the majority of their standards through what they call technical committees, or TCs. Now, the countries are really the member bodies who participate through their national groups on behalf of ISO. So, for instance, in the U.S., we participate in the ISO standards through a group called ANSI, A-N-S-I, which is the American National Standards Institute. And ANSI contracts with a lot of different organizations in the U.S. to be administrators. And when we talk about the life cycle group, for instance, another group under ANSI is the ASQ, or the American Society for Quality. So really, it's through those two U.S. standard groups, the ASQ and ANSI, that U.S. participates in this process. Other countries obviously have their own standards organizations. So these technical advisory groups basically conduct the standards work in the U.S. And we'll get into that a little bit. So what are these U.S. tags? You'll hear the word tag a lot in ISO, and it's kind of like the game of tag. It means you're it. Basically, that's where everything happens. In the case of the Technical Committee 207, which is the one that basically deals with environmental management, and that's the one we'll be talking about today, that particular tag of 207 has all kinds of different activities under it. Not only the life cycle group, labeling, environmental management systems, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But I think the key here is within this U.S. tag, we basically have a voice in the standards process of coming up with a consensus standard. And again, I think it's important to remember that we're dealing with a lot of countries. So in this case, the U.S. has one vote as a country. So within that technical group, we all kind of come together, put together the U.S. position, and then we come to the table. So again, going back to my 1993 kickoff of the ISO lifecycle standards, at the time, I believe there was 30 countries that were participating, and the U.S. Back then had like 400 people in their delegation. But again, we had one vote. So it's important for the U.S. to be able to be represented. So what are the roles of these standards group, ANSI and ASQ? As I mentioned before, these tags are authorized by ANSI. So whenever we go to one of these tag meetings, it's really the standards group that kind of administers it. We pull everything together. And as I mentioned before, ASQ is really kind of the main group that does this TC 207 work that we'll be talking about today. So what those administrators do, and I'll tell you who those people are, is they're kind of really, they're the key staff folks that work with the tags. They submit the U.S. position to the U.S. standard group ANSI for submission to ISO. There's a formal process, but for all of you on the phone, as individual members, for instance, of the U.S. tag, your organizations, you have a vote, and then together as a U.S. tag, we come up with like a position. And later on today, Kuma is going to go over in detail where we are on one of the more active life cycle standards tags. So who are these standards teams? And now I'll just kind of give you some contact information here. If any of you on the phone are interested in participating in the ISO process, if you're not already involved and you kind of want to know the details, there's a couple of folks on the ASQ team that can definitely help you out. Jennifer Admonson is the standards manager. and Julie Sharp is the standards administrator. Jennifer and Julie are really kind of the people that are the putting together all the information for all these meetings that many of us that participate. So again, if you wanted to contact them on what it means to join ANSI, to be able to participate on, definitely go ahead and do that. And then finally, before I hand this over, I've included some helpful links for those of you that really want to get into that. And again, this is mainly for ASQ and ANSI. I'm kind of wearing my recruiting hat here, but it is a nominal membership to participate, and you have to be a member of one of these groups. We're talking, dollars, not a lot of investment, but it gives you an opportunity to participate. So with that now, I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer Prinzing, and she's going to really get involved in where we in ACLCA get involved with ISO. So at this point, Jennifer, could you pick it up from here?
I sure can. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Debbie, for organizing us, and all of you for listening in. So yeah, as Mike described, I'm going to tell us a little bit more about how ACLCA can and does get involved in this ISO process. It's very important because we in the U.S. are the practitioners and those that are using these standards, and really have a stake in making sure that the standards remain good quality and usable for all of us as practitioners. So how can the voice of ACLCA be heard at ISO? And one of the ways is for us to actually, as an organization, become a liaison member of ISO. And we've begun the process of doing that and getting a liaison member approved. But this lets us have a voice, not a vote, but a voice at the task group and subcommittee level within ISO, which is, as I say, very important because we are, in the U.S., those that are using the standards and those with the technical expertise around ACLCA. Within ACLCA, we also just use our policy committee, the membership, to provide input on life cycle issues in this process. On the next slide, I can show that we have many of the members of that policy committee are engaged with the ISO technical committees within the U.S. and other groups. So we do have a voice, but to have a formal position and a formal voice, we're working on that liaison status. So we're hoping that that will become reality here fairly soon. So I'm going to go to the next slide that does show those policy committee members on specifically the SC5 Technical Advisory Group. So you can see a number of organizations, and the highlight here is a lot of the overlap, right? So many of the members of the policy committee are members on that ISO subcommittee 5 related to life cycle assessment. So a lot of those groups, so they all participate in those meetings, share their expertise and their opinions on the conversation that leads to the U.S. position for the ISO LCA standards. Going next to how's the international work done? So U.S. TAG, as Mike described, in our case, managed by ASQ, that U.S. TAG meets and appoints a delegation before each of the international ISO meetings. So that delegation will then represent the U.S. viewpoint. They'll be able, there's ideally people who can negotiate and cooperate and state our position and get that voice heard at the international level. So it's important to have a strong delegation who has come away from the U.S. meetings with a strong understanding of the U.S. position and ability to advocate for it when we get to those international meetings. On the next slide, we're talking about consensus at the tags. Openness, so those are open to all U.S. interested parties who are directly affected. So all of us as life cycle assessment practitioners would fall into that category. Consensus, of course, requires balance of interest. Developing the U.S. position needs to take into account the broad range of folks who are interested in the LCA standards and those who are using them. And then each participating member of that tag has one vote in coming up with the consensus in that process. So that was some about, how this happens. What we wanted to get across on the next slide is why should I help write a standard? We're really looking for practitioners in the U.S. to get involved, to make their opinions heard, to bring their expertise forward. You get people involved in these meetings who are not necessarily practitioners who are doing this day-to-day and working with the standards and working with the impact of LCA and how it's used. So that's the why. Why should you help write a standard? Get involved with these committees. You will have an international impact. It'll affect your organization. If you don't get involved and your organization has a strong opinion about the ISO standards around LCA, these things will happen without you if you don't raise your hand and get involved. And the people in the room may not have the best interests of your organization at heart. So it could be your competitors, it could be stakeholders who are not LCA practitioners who have other ideas about how LCA should be used or proceed. So your voice is important at any level to that you can get involved. If you use LCA and it's important to you that it's accepted and done competently and that the standards remain vital, getting involved to help write or modify standards is important. Going on to the next slide, this is a little bit of what's in it for you as you participate. You do get very unparalleled access to the decision makers in ISO and the high-level folks who have been involved writing the ISO standards and maintaining them. So it's a good visibility for yourself to get involved, to have conversation with those folks, and then as you grow, to let your strong voice be heard in the development and evolution of the standards. So that's your own personal as well as your organization. So if you're a member of a company who uses LCA or another organization, this does provide very high level access to the folks who are responsible for the ISO standards. And then the last point there, of course, is keeping these standards up to date and vital is important, because if we don't do that, we can count on the potential for governments to fill the gap with regulation. So having a strong standard that the community abides by does keep at bay governments filling that gap. So that's another reason to get and stay involved. So how can you participate? The simplest way is to join the U.S. Technical Advisory Group. That lets you be an active participant in this process and contribute specifically to the development of the U.S. input. It's a good way for you to attend those meetings in person and feedback to your own organization. So not having to have a secondhand reporting on what's going on within the U.S. tags and the ISO standard processes. You can get there yourself and report back to your organization to have a closer connection and a better way to influence the standards. So then finally, we're just getting to, many of you probably know most of this, but examples of the ISO standards that we're talking about here that the technical advisory groups are responsible for maintaining. So we've got two slides here. The first one being a list of the environmental ISO standards that the U.S. tag is influencing, and highlighted at the top, of course, the ISO 14040 and 14044 are the life cycle assessment standards specifically. So those are at the top of the list, but then you can see as you go down, we've got the additional related standards on water footprint, eco-efficiency, environmental performance evaluation, greenhouse gas. So all of those are ones that through participation in the tags, you can have the opportunity to learn more about and influence. So that is where my comments end, and I'll hand off to Kuma, who, along with myself, has been involved recently in the ISO tag and technical committee activities around the life cycle assessment ISO standards. So with that, Kuma, please take it away and provide some more detail on that current and developing news. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Kuma Sumathipala. I'm with the American Wood Council, and I've been participating in ISO TC 207 Subcommittee 5, and I'm going to give you some recent activities and some places where ACLCA can make a real contribution to what's happening with respect to two particular standards, ISO 14040, which is the environmental management life cycle assessment, which has the requirements and guidelines on how to do LCA, and its companion standard, ISO 14044, which is the environmental management life cycle assessment principles and framework. It's the latter standard that really has the main meat of what to do on or how to do a proper life cycle assessment. And on the bottom of the slide, on the right-hand side, for those with a very good eyesight, I have the list of countries listed just for completeness. The Subcommittee 5 has 56 voting countries and 20 observer countries. Observer countries vote is not counted, but they get to comment and they get to see what's going on. And it also has 15 liaison members. Quite a few of the 15 liaison members are from European interests, and that's probably because they have a lot more interest, or they have chosen to integrate themselves with the Subcommittee 5. Now, with the ISO system, each subcommittee has complete technical control over the standards. So these standards are essentially balloted only within the subcommittee. The Technical Committee 207 sets the policy direction of what the subcommittees can do, but don't really get involved in the technical details of it. So once the Technical Committee approves a new standard to be developed, and Technical Committee needs to do that, it's up to the subcommittee to develop the content. So only the subcommittee has control over the content of a standard. And one thing to note of the membership, Russia on this case is actually an observer country of life cycle assessment. Whether that represents the level of engagement in life cycle assessment, I don't know, but I thought it'll be important to at least recognize that fairly large economy is only an observer member. I'm going to give an update on the timeline of what has happened with ISO 140 and 14044 standards. These two standards were initially developed in 2006. 5 years later, there was a ballot to reaffirm them as published in 2006, so no changes were made in 2011. And ISO requires that standards be reviewed every 5 years. In 2015, roughly about 2.5 years ago, we had a ballot to say, hey, do you really want to update ISO 14040 and 14044? And in that ballot, 90 countries said, no, we don't want to open up the standard for any revision. We'd like to keep it the way it is. We essentially reaffirmed it till 2021. So I'm sure the voting countries of SC5 assume that the standards would probably remain the way they were published in 2006 as it was. But last year at an SC5 meeting in Halifax, we had another look at it. And before I get to that one, we also published a new Annex C to ISO 14044. That was done in 2016-2017. That standard is now approved, and we can talk the details of that one in a minute. But I also want to give the fact that at the last year, at the meeting in Halifax, we also decided to create a task group to revise ISO 14044, and I will walk you through how we ended up being able to revise 14040 and 44 after 90 countries have actually voted to keep it the way it is in 2006. All right, I'll give an update on what's happened with the new annex to ISO 14044. This was done last year. This annex recognizes two particular footprints by name. It recognizes the carbon footprint, ISO 14067, and the water footprint, 14047. It recognizes them as being compliant with ISO 14044. However, with the caveat that the report of any of those footprint standards have to say that a footprint report does not necessarily address the other impacts. It essentially gives a warm and a fuzzy feeling about footprints, and that appears to be the intent of Annex C, that footprints are somewhat life cycle assessment compliant, but does not necessarily address the other impacts. U.S. had a fairly diversified view on this particular annex. Some in the U.S. delegations felt that this will justify footprints as being somewhat akin to life cycle assessment, whereas most know that life cycle assessment is more than just a single footprint. But nevertheless, this is what the Annex C did. In the final ballot, the U.S., Singapore, and I think a couple of other countries voted against the Annex C. They didn't like the fact that the footprints are perhaps given a prominent recognition within a life cycle assessment standard. But that is what it is. It's a warm and fuzzy feeling for footprints through this new Annex C. All right, I'm going to go to what happened at the June 2017 meeting of the subcommittee 5. We had a resolution. We took a resolution with 15 members out of our 56 members who were present. We resolved that we are going to look at some items for future work. And the items for future work will be based on the comments that were received on the ballots that asked, do we really want to update the ISO 14044 and ISO 14040 standards? Based on those comments, we'll develop a group of perhaps future work. This was done by just the 15 members who were present in the Halifax meeting, and we decided to create a task group to look at this work. The task group was signed up by 13 members. Out of the 13 members who signed up to be in the task group, 10 were part of the resolution. So there were 3 others who signed up after the resolution was taken. So I believe those 3 countries are people who read the minutes of the meeting and decided, hey, something's going on in here. We want to be a part of that activity. And I have highlighted those countries for those with a very good eyesight. The 3 countries who were not members of the the people who voted for the resolution is Brazil, South Korea, and Switzerland. So they somehow got on board. They are members of the task group, and they also have 2 liaison groups who signed up to be part of this task group. So this new task group would go ahead and revise ISO 140 and 14044. This activity already started in October of last year and will continue throughout this year. And this is perhaps one place where ACLCA can provide some technical wherewithal to what type of revisions are taking place and in what shape should they be, and where these 2 standards may likely head. Even though the revisions are developed by this task group, they will eventually be balloted through all the 56 countries. But as usually happens with ISO standards, once it is balloted, it becomes somewhat of a harder task to do revisions. It'll be much easier to do the revisions we want while the document is still at the task group level. Moving on to the task group activities. The task group met in October, and we created several drafting committees to actually draft technical content. And I'm going to highlight the more important drafting committee activities that's currently underway. And one drafting committee is developing attributional lifecycle assessment versus consequential lifecycle assessment text. The rationale for this inclusion in 14044 in this case is there is a write-up in ISO 14040 Annex A. It refers to 2 separate approaches. It doesn't name them. The discussion that took place in the drafting committee is that the approach A, as defined in Annex A of ISO 14044 or 14040, is attributional. So they are essentially naming approach A as an attributional approach. And the approach B is consequential. So that demarcation would likely be made by the text that the drafting committee will develop. And in addition to that, there will be an expansion of how the attributional work needs to be done and consequential needs to be done. This can be an important change, that there will be 2 paths to assess life cycle, and it'll be the attributional that'll have route, and then the consequential. It appears that most of the people are comfortable with the attributional approach, and consequential appears to be the new method or the new approach around the block. And if I were to go over some of the discussion that occurred in the drafting committee, I would say that the consequential appears to be bring more controversial aspects for discussion, at least. And it might be of interest to see how the text is being developed and how ACLCA may choose to weigh in on the further development of this text. Sure. Thank you, Mike. Mike just brought me the definition from the glossary of the Environmental Life Cycle Assessment Bible, if you will. It refers to the attributional modeling as LCI modeling framework that inventories the input and output flows of all processes of a system as they occur. So I don't think this is defined consequential. All right, it has a consequential modeling as LCI modeling principles that identifies and models all processes in the background system in consequence of decisions made in the foreground system.
So one's in real time.
Yeah, one's in real time, the other one's processed in the background as well. The drafting committee really hasn't made a lot of progress. We have had multiple conference calls. I know those are the definitions in the book, but the drafting committee has not been able to agree even on the definitions of the two. So that's where we are. So any help the drafting committee can get would be worthwhile. The next drafting committee I'm going to highlight is under the task group to amend 14044 and 14040 is drafting committee number A5. This drafting committee is dealing with text for allocation, and it will be an informative annex to ISO 14044. The difference between a normative annex and an informative annex in the ISO jargon is that a normative annex can be adopted along with the standard, and it will be mandated. Informative annex, on the other hand, is not something that you can mandate to be adopted. They're just for information, as the name implies. So this allocation text that would be in the annex to ISO 14044 would be informative. But that said, there's no reason to prevent an informative annex from becoming a normative annex down the road. So I think whatever allocation material that goes into this annex should be reviewed, assuming that it can become a normative annex further down the road. This annex has identified 3 sections that they want to deal with. It's the multifunctional processes with core products, how to handle those. There'll be some guidance on that, on how to allocate and reuse of products and recycling of products. So there will be some distinction that would be brought between the reuse and the recycling aspects also as a part of this new text. Okay, now we get on to the next activity under this drafting committee. This drafting committee also plans to develop a completely new standard, a new technical specification. Again, in the ISO verbiage, a technical specification is a document that is one level or one notch below an ISO standard. It is an ISO document. It's an ISO technical specification. Technical specifications typically have a limited life, 6 years usually, and would usually upgrade itself to an international standard or thrown out. Now, what this standard is likely to do is develop requirements and guidelines for weighting, interpretation, and using results in decision-making processes. There are some members in the drafting committee who believe that there should be one life cycle number, LCA number, for a product, that we'd be able to look at all the LCA attributes and say this particular product is 16 compared to another product that is 25, whatever that number might mean. And I know the life cycle assessment practitioners would find this somewhat unacceptable, because there are some you really can't wait and come up with a single number, but there is apparently a desire within the group to do just that, and how they're going to provide guidance on it, how to do weighting and interpretation would be of interest. This particular drafting committee has not made a significant inroads as yet, but I do expect there will be some activity on this in the next 1 or 2 months. So this is an ongoing activity. It's still in a flux. Whether it'll go anywhere is another issue. But given the ISO system and given how the balloting works, once the document's produced, it would likely move forward. So out of the 56 member countries, as I said, not everybody is engaged directly on the technical content of it, and those countries typically tend to vote affirmative when they get a ballot, assuming that it has received a substantial technical review by whoever who developed it, and it usually gets voted positive. So something that ACLCA members should consider providing technical input into this particular new technical specification on rating. It will have a 14,000 number to it, and ISO Central Secretariat is fairly cautious about giving out the 14,000 series numbers. Apparently, it's a fairly valued commodity to have a 14,000 number on a standard, but this standard was chosen as one of those that receives that special recognition. That decision has already been made. I'm going to give you the timetable on how this task group plans to work on it. The first meeting of the task group happened in October 16 to 18. I was at that meeting, and there were some representatives from the U.S. who tried to join in through the phone service. It was not ideal, but there was some participation through the phone, but most of the activity took place around the table. The drafting committee created several editing teams, and I described the editing teams and the 3 important ones for ACLCA that's occurring. And the task groups are moving forward. The second meeting of this particular task group is scheduled for 27th and 28th of March this year. It'll be in Berlin. They do expect about 20 people to show up at the meeting and participate. And I'm going to highlight the meeting date, so we have a good idea about timing. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so the task group to amend the ISO 14040 and 44, they'll, as I said, will occur on March 27 and 28 in Berlin. And whatever activities that this task group does will be presented to the ISO TC 207 Subcommittee 5 meeting scheduled for June 5 through 8 in 2018. So that's the timetable, and that's the activity of ISO. That's pretty much all I had. I will hand over to Debbie if anyone has any questions or anything for the discussion. Please, Debbie, it's yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike, Jennifer, and Kuma. As you see, we have up on the screen here, we will be having future ISO TC webinars, but wanted to remind you to please put your questions into the GoToWebinar panel, and we will be able to get them to our speakers. So let's see. The first question that we have is what
Debbie,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Debbie, this is Mike Levy. Before we get to the questions, you can show the next slide. And while people put in their questions, I just wanted to add, first of all, in addition to the ISO activity here that we're highlighting with this policy committee, I encourage any of you that are involved in additional related issues to definitely contact any one of us. For instance, the policy committee that Jennifer showed you, which represents at least 20 different organizations, from all kinds of walks of life, university agencies. One of the things that we're doing in the world of life cycle there is developing backgrounders on probably some key topics that you and all of us are dealing with related to life cycle. That would be things like sustainable materials management, circular economy, and the role of life cycle in green product procurement. So as ACLCA, as part of their education role on this responsible use of LCA, our first step is to really just develop backgrounders for all of us to understand what those issues are and what LCA components are. And then to what we just talked about, much like in the ISO activity, we'll then determine what kind of policy or what kind of position that ACACL will take on that. So we really encourage any of you to join our activities, because these are things that us and individual organizations are dealing with. And by pulling all of our knowledge together at ACLCA, we're getting some really good input to make sure that whatever's developed really reflects the cross section. So with that, Debbie, I'll turn it back to you for the questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mike. So our first question is, can you participate in the ISO process as a practitioner and not through one's organization?
All right. ISO, the membership of ISO is limited to countries. So it's one country, one vote. So the participation in this case would be through the U.S. Technical Advisory Group, or the U.S. TAG, as Mike alluded to. Yes, practitioners are welcome to join the U.S. TAG, and they should. And that's the way that they can get their voice in. Then you become part of the U.S. input into the ISO process. The second option to have a non-voting status is through a liaison member. And as Jennifer highlighted, ACLCA is seriously considering joining Subcommittee 5 as a liaison member.
Great, thank you. Our next question is whether the weighting technical specification will be mandatory or not.
The standards are pretty much voluntary, all standards, unless and until they are adopted by some regulatory body. So if a regulatory body adopts the weighting standard, yes, it'll become mandated. But until that happens, it's just voluntary.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is Mike Levy. Is that the entire ISO process really is about a voluntary consensus standard, and Kuma is absolutely right. Some regulatory body then, whether it's a country or another organization, as they adopt those standards, then they become a little bit more general practice and mandated.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what is exactly the role of a liaison?
The role of a liaison is to provide technical input. A liaison has a seat at the table. A liaison does not have a vote when the document goes out to ballot. But liaison has all the other ingredients of a country member other than the vote.
Great. Our next question is, has anyone in A6 looked at ASTM's 3096 that has weighting and normalization on KPIs related to environmental aspects of manufacturing processes?
That's a very interesting question. I myself have not looked at it. I assuming that there will be some members of the U.S. TAG who has.
Great. The next question is, does ACLCA have a mechanism or process for aggregating comments on the ISO TC 207/SC5 activities?
This is Jennifer. The way that we're doing that is through the policy committee. So we have a regular agenda item on that policy committee meeting to discuss any current activities that need an ACLCA statement to be taken back to the ISO process, or just to provide updates on what's happening. So if you do want to participate in that discussion, have an influence, the policy committee would be the place to participate.
Yeah, that policy committee generally has teleconference for participation, and we try to do that at least every other month. And then if there's a special meeting, like Kuma mentioned, the Halifax meeting last year, we may need to schedule another session. But that is the process. Jennifer's right that we use the committee really as kind of the brainstorming to come up with reviewing those documents and come up with kind of a mini position.
Great, thank you. The next question is, when do we expect the work of TC 207/SC5 to be completed and the updates to ISO 14040 and 14044 to be made?
That's if you do come to some meeting of the minds, and not clear whether we'll get there, but if we do, you're likely to see the first ballot of the 3 items I talked about in the fall of this year. I'm being very optimistic. But yes, the earliest we'd see a document that'll be balloted, that'll see each country's comments on it, would be fall of 2018.
Our next question is, what are the mechanisms to respond to the 3 drafting documents?
The method to respond right now is look at the draft technical documents that we currently have and provide input to the task group. Right now, ACLCA can choose to look at the current docs and actually provide comments. This is something that the policy committee may choose to do. That may be an option. Mike?
And again, the policy committee individual members of the ISO tag likewise provide comments. So it's kind of a 1-2 step. Each organization member that's on that PC tag representing the organization can comment on those drafts. And then as a group within ACLCA and with Jennifer Prinzing as our representative, we kind of give our overall ACLCA comments as well.
Great. The next question is, someone is asking to confirm that the changes suggested by the task group won't come into effect until 2021. Is that correct?
I don't know. They can change the standard for 2021. The timing has not been decided. The standard can change in the next year or 2. It might not have to wait till 2021.
Great. Okay, so the next question is, we are working in higher level of LCA. How do you connect the mentioned changes with PCR and EPD in your relation with the latest ISO?
As Kuma talked about, starting out in the history there was a document that was developed, I think he said 2016, that identified a laundry list of those items that people wanted to kind of agree on. It ranged from PCRs and EPDs and footprints and things like that. And I believe at the time, there were like 8 different items that there was like consensus on. These would be the items that would be developed. What we've now explained is that this task group is focusing in on a few specific items there. And right now, PCRs and EPDs aren't on that list. So the way it works is the drafting committee is zeroed in. I believe it was recycling, reuse, consequential, attributional. Those are the items right now that are going to be drafted up. Any other additional items are kind of outside of the scope of those drafting committees. But the process is, as Jennifer mentioned too, on consensus, is that as a U.S. tag, for instance, we surveyed all of our members and came up with what are the items that we would agree to kind of talk about. And now this new task group is kind of moving ahead with limiting themselves on those. So the short answer is PCRs and EPDs, which have their separate ISO standards right now, are not part of 14040 or 44, but clearly there'll be a dialogue going on as this thing evolves.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank all of our speakers today, Mike, Jennifer, and Kuma. We know you are all very busy, so we're going to wrap it up now, but please feel free to contact us after the webinar, and we'd be happy to talk with you more one-on-one. You can see the speaker slides, and our contact information is up. We look forward to seeing you all on our next webinar or event. The full list can be found on ACLCA's webpage. And if you aren't already an ACLCA member, I encourage you to become one, as we've got some great member-only webinars. As you heard, you'll also be able to participate in the policy committee. Thank you again to our speakers and to all of you for joining us. I hope you have a great day.